or increase fishery populations in the stream if this goes through. Wouldn't it be prudent to have some trial watersheds where we actually do some of these projects, look at fish populations before we impact private citizens spending private dollars to do this when we don't know what the actual outcome will be? Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll take a couple of attempts at this. First of all, his question regarding or statement about existing facilities on stream that he has that are potentially intercepting sediment loading and sediment movement downstream. Technically, we've tried to address the movement of sediments and the geomorphology of the streams in the policy. Whether or not they're intercepting erosion or collecting erosion or sediment in these reservoirs, and whether or not it's a benefit or a detriment to the stream channel is part of the evaluation. But also note that existing facilities that in some respects were built without the benefit of a permit or license may also have the problem that we have to go back and evaluate. A facility that may have been there a number of years, that it's come to some level of equilibrium, is catching sediments, is providing some fish and wildlife habitat benefits, that removing it or taking it out may be a detriment to those things that have come to equilibrium. That's a dilemma we're trying to address or take into consideration. But also, any removal of a dam brings apart our sister agencies' requirements to the Regional Water Quality Control Board, waste discharge permits for doing so, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers under the 404 permitting process. All of those would have to be satisfied. Those are concerns and issues that we're also very, very much aware of. So removal of a dam may not be necessarily the best option, although they still don't have the benefit in some cases of a permit or license from us, so we would have to address that one way or another. Perhaps Eric can expand on that a little bit about our approach to that.
Well, I think it was covered well. Similar to the question on stream dams and the removal of habitat, in the substitute environmental document, the CEQA document, we did do an evaluation and determine that erosion from dam removal could have a potentially significant impact. So we are acknowledging that there are likely other protection measures in place. It's not that someone can just go out and start working in a stream channel unsupervised with no approval for that. It's the removal of the dam, ideally, and according to other laws that are in place, would have to be done in a manner that was protective and minimize sedimentation impacts. But again, we did acknowledge it as a potentially significant impact.
Okay, thank you. Tim Buckner, followed by Alec Rohrbaugh.
Thank you. I'd like to congratulate the supervisors on their swift response to this issue, and it's pretty critical to our community, I think, that we understand these concerns and complications right away. So thank you very much. I, in my reading of the document, and I'm not a professional or a consultant, but I think I got the impression that these standards were developed in the state of Washington about 20 years ago. Those regulations have been brought to Mendocino County and the other policy area counties from that area. And my question was, have they done any follow-up studies to see if this actually works in that area to justify the outrageous costs that are going to be placed on the applicants in this area? And the costs are outrageous. We're literally talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars per facility, per dam. With that kind of money, we could build parks, diners, diversion around Lake Mendocino and open up a huge amount of salmonid habitat. The second question I have is, did the fish come back in those areas? And if they did, where are the data? I couldn't find that in the policy, in the draft policy. My third question is, I have another minute. For about 15 years, environmental groups, particularly Trout Unlimited, have exerted a huge influence over the application process. Got to the point where they're recently writing regulation. When will the applicants have that opportunity to influence the policy or the regulations? At the moment, the applicants have been blocked out. They're not treated fairly, and I'd like to see that changed. And if the board did anything, our board of supervisors that is, I would ask that they try to get the state board to recognize the plight of the applicants. We're not talking about just hundreds of people. We're literally talking about many thousands affected by this. And hopefully, when the time comes, Mendocino County will actually have the budget to be able to support all the unemployed that are going to result from this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Buckner.
To speak to the question of the state of Washington, the standards from the state of Washington, I don't think anything directly, any of the criteria in the policy directly came from standards that have been applied in the state of Washington. They were developed based on a fairly exhaustive literature search that may have included information from the North Coast, California, Oregon, Washington, in terms of for example, the depth of flow that's needed to provide spawning habitat for a steelhead or a Chinook salmon. But that's all fairly uniform. It's based on the biology of the fish as opposed to the geographic areas. I think maybe where the confusion's coming from in developing the minimum bypass flow requirement, it was based on data from the studies are called, Swift was the author, and it was based on data that was collected in the state of Washington, coastal areas in the state of Washington, where they went out and they measured transects and they developed the relationships between flow, drainage area, and the depth of water in these streams. But that data set from Washington was augmented with valid data we call validation site data that was collected within the 5-county area by our own consultants more recently. So yes, some data and possibly some standards that were developed in Washington were used in formulating the criteria, but I don't believe the criteria, any of them, have been applied anywhere else.
Okay. Supervisor Dope. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. Oh.
The data weren't used in that manner. It was the data that I was speaking of from Washington were flow habitat relationship data. How much water does it take to fill a channel with a certain size contributing watershed? The study the data weren't used to determine, they had no connection between did the fish come back. So they're not connected to reality. No, they're connected to the habitat needs of the different species that are of concern in the policy area. So I'd say they are connected to reality.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I think what Eric's saying is that no criteria were developed, and they did not apply those criteria to impose protective stream flows in Washington. So there was no way to assess whether or not fish came back because the criteria were not, the studies were not implemented into criteria.
And then the last kind of follow-up question, he mentioned concerns about the access that Trout Unlimited has to the regulatory process and to the legislative process. Granted, they may have more resources than an individual, but they also have the same access. The applicant has the same access that Trout Unlimited has, and in some cases, the various farm bureaus, the various local groups have had similar access and similar impact upon our process as Trout Unlimited. But also, as you know, historically, some of these the various groups have put together a group and funding and sources that have, they've championed their cause to some degree. But I would say the access is the same pretty much for everybody. In many cases, the state board probably experiences more influence from the ag industry than we do from Trout Unlimited or